Welcome to our revenge series. Today's story is about what happens when you push someone too far, especially when that someone isn't entirely human. But before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to my channel, unless you want a visit from a certain cat-faced lady. Now, let's get into the story. My name is William Carter, and I grew up in a small, tight-knit village in the English countryside. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are whispered, but never spoken aloud. I suppose that's why it took so long for us to realize the horror that had been growing in the old Langley house on the edge of town. Mrs. Langley was an old woman, widowed for many years, and she lived with her only son, Edward, and his wife, Margaret. Edward was a good man, but his work often took him away from home, leaving Mrs. Langley alone with Margaret. The townsfolk would gossip, as they do, about how Margaret treated the old woman. You could hear the rumors if you lingered too long in the market, whispers about how Margaret would shout at Mrs. Langley, berating her for wetting herself, for being a burden. I remember seeing Mrs. Langley in the village sometimes, her frail figure hunched over, as she walked with her old cat, a scruffy black thing that never left her side. She always seemed so small, so defeated, but she would smile at anyone who passed by, a sad, resigned sort of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I never thought much of it then, just another old woman in the twilight of her life. But looking back, I can see the signs, the cracks in her spirit that were slowly, cruelly widening. One cold winter night, as the winds howled through the narrow streets, Mrs. Langley took her own life. They found her hanging from a beam in her bedroom, the cat curled up beneath her, staring up at her lifeless body with those unnervingly bright green eyes. It was Edward who found her, home on one of his rare visits. He was devastated, of course, but the story doesn't end there. You see, the cat died that night too. They found it later, behind the firewood stack, poisoned by rat bait that had been scattered around the house. Margaret claimed it was an accident, that she hadn't meant to harm the old woman's beloved pet, but the villagers weren't so sure. There was talk of Margaret wanting to rid the house of everything that reminded her of Mrs. Langley, of wanting to start fresh now that the old woman was gone. They kept Mrs. Langley's body in the house for a few days, as was the custom, while they prepared for the funeral. That's when the strange things started happening. The night after Mrs. Langley died, Margaret was in the kitchen, getting ready to prepare dinner. She'd gone out to fetch some firewood when she let out a scream that echoed through the village. Edward came running, and when he reached her, he found the cat, or what was left of it, lying in the snow behind the house. But that wasn't the worst part. From inside the house there was a noise, something crashing, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down Edward's spine. He rushed inside, Margaret close behind him, and what they found made their blood run cold. Mrs. Langley's body was no longer lying on the bed where they had left her. She was standing, her head hanging limply to one side, her eyes wide open and filled with a feral rage. But her face, God, her face, had changed. It was no longer the wrinkled, tired face of an old woman. It had become something twisted, something animalistic, with sharp, gleaming teeth and eyes that glowed with a sickly green light, just like the cat's. Margaret screamed again, stumbling back into Edward, who was too stunned to move. Mrs. Langley, or whatever she had become, let out a horrible, ear-piercing screech, a sound that was neither human nor animal, and then she pounced. Edward tried to protect Margaret, but he was no match for the thing that had once been his mother. The next morning, the village awoke to the news that Edward and Margaret were dead. Their bodies were found torn apart, as if by some wild beast, but there were no tracks, no signs that anything had entered or left the house. And Mrs. Langley's body was nowhere to be found. The authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, a wild animal attack. But we all knew better. The village was buzzing with fear, and the whispers grew louder. Mrs. Langley had come back, they said. come back with the spirit of that damned cat inside her. For weeks, the village was gripped by terror. People locked their doors and windows at night, and no one went out after dark. There were sightings. People claimed they saw a figure, hunched over, with glowing eyes, prowling the outskirts of the village, always just at the edge of the light. Chickens went missing, pets disappeared, and some said they heard that same terrible screech echoing through the night. But it wasn't just the animals. Children started to vanish. At first it was just one, a little girl who had been playing near the woods. Then another, and another. The village was in a panic, parents keeping their children close, fearing that they would be next. The village elders decided it was time to take action. They organized a group of men to patrol the village at night, to hunt down whatever was responsible for the disappearances. My father was among them. I remember the look on his face when he left that night, rifle in hand, determination in his eyes, tempered by fear. They searched the village from top to bottom, combed through the woods, but they found nothing. Then, one night, as the patrol was making its rounds, they heard it. The screech. It was coming from the old Langley house, which had been abandoned since Edward and Margaret's deaths. The men, my father among them, approached the house cautiously, their torches flickering in the cold wind. They pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the house was dark, the air thick with the stench of decay. And there, in the center of the room, was Mrs. Langley, her back to them, hunched over something on the floor. The men could see her body twitching, hear the wet, crunching sounds that made their stomachs turn. One of the men called out to her, but she didn't respond. Slowly she turned to face them, and they saw what she had become. Her face was a grotesque fusion of human and cat, her eyes glowing with that eerie green light. Blood dripped from her mouth, and in her hands she held the remains of the missing children, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. My father was the first to react. He raised his rifle, aimed and fired. The bullet struck Mrs. Langley in the shoulder, and she let out that horrible screech, but she didn't go down. Instead, she lunged at them, moving faster than any human should. The men scattered, firing their rifles wildly, but Mrs. Langley was relentless. She tore into them, ripping flesh with her claws, her teeth gnashing in a frenzy of bloodlust. In the chaos, my father managed to get off another shot, this time hitting her in the chest. She staggered, the glow in her eyes dimming. But she didn't fall. Instead, she turned and fled, disappearing into the night, leaving the men behind, battered and bleeding. They found her body the next day, deep in the woods, half buried in the snow. But she wasn't alone. Curled up next to her, just like in life, was the cat, its eyes still glowing faintly. Even in death, the villagers buried them both in an unmarked grave, far away from the village, hoping that would be the end of it. But even now, years later, people still talk about the cat-faced woman. They say that on cold winter nights, you can hear her screech echoing through the trees, and if you're unlucky enough to see her, those glowing green eyes will be the last thing you ever see. And so the old Langley house remains abandoned, a place where no one dares to go. The children, they say, can still be heard laughing in the woods, their voices carried on the wind, a reminder of the horrors that took place there. And the cat-faced woman, her spirit never at rest, continues to haunt the village, a curse that will never die.